For all its beauty and splendor, the ocean can be a cruel teacher. The sea in wartime is a graveyard waiting to open. Steel can turn to splinters in a heartbeat, and ships that look invincible one moment can vanish the next beneath fire and foam. Men who serve at sea know this truth. When the guns thunder and the torpedoes strike, survival is measured in luck as much as courage. To live through a sinking is already a miracle. To claw your way back from the abyss when you are only a cat, it's almost unthinkable. Let's venture back to the unforgiving ocean where survival is earned, not given. This is outdoor disasters. For Unsinkable Sam, his World War II service would be legendary. The sea was a theater of giants in 1941. Nations pitted their steel leviathans against each other across oceans that stretched cold and indifferent, swallowing the ambitions of men without pause. The Atlantic was not merely a battlefield, it was a graveyard waiting to be filled. Convoys steamed across gray horizons, stalked by U-boats, hunted by warships, and harried by aircraft. Every ship that left port did so under the shadow of uncertainty, and every sailor knew that beneath the calm or stormy surface lay an abyss deep enough to erase him without a trace. It was in this world of steel and salt water, of superstition and survival, that a small figure prowled unnoticed. He was not a captain or an admiral. He carried no medals, nor did he draw pay. He was a cat, black and white, sleek but sturdy, with the sure-footed gait that felines carry as if they know something men do not. Sailors have always carried cats with them to sea. The reasons were practical. Mice and rats could devastate grain stores or chew through rope and wiring. A good mouser kept supplies safe. But the reasons were also spiritual. A cat was considered a talisman. A cat brought luck. Its presence on board was thought to appease the whims of the sea. Some swore cats could sense storms, their fur standing on end hours before dark weather arrived. Others whispered that a cat would not stay aboard a ship destined to sink. It would vanish, leap overboard, or clawed ashore as if guided by some sixth sense denied to men. So, when a black and white Tom was taken aboard the Bismarck, the most powerful battleship Nazi Germany had ever launched, he was just another quiet part of maritime tradition. He padded across the deck while men in crisp Kriegsmarine uniforms drilled beneath the gaze of their officers. He dozed in warm corners near the great boilers while the ship's engines rumbled like a caged beast. The Bismarck itself was a monster, a floating fortress of 823 feet in length, bristling with 8 15-inch guns that could hurl a shell weighing as much as a small car. Its mission was to prowl the Atlantic and cut the lifeline between Britain and America, starving an island nation into submission. The cat could not have known the stakes, nor the fact that his steel home was already being hunted. He only knew the familiar rhythms of life at sea, the smell of oil and salt, the vibrations through the deck, the shadows of men moving above him. On May 27, 1941, the sea erupted around him. Shells from British warships screamed through the air and smashed into steel, tearing holes that geysered fire and twisted iron. The thunder of naval guns echoed across the waves like a storm made of metal. Men were flung into the sea, swallowed by explosions, burned or drowned as water poured through ruptures in the hull. The Bismarck groaned, shuddered, and began to die. Somewhere amid that apocalypse, this cat's world shattered. Whether he was thrown into the water or clung to debris or carried out by desperate hands, no one can say with certainty. What is remembered is that as the mighty battleship slipped beneath the waves, dragging more than 2,000 souls with her, a single cat floated upon a plank of wood, his black fur slicked with oil, his white chest stained but still rising and falling with breath. He had no awareness of history, no comprehension that only a handful of human survivors clung to life around him. He only knew the sea, and that he must hold on. When a British destroyer, HMS Cossack, arrived on the scene to pluck survivors from the wreckage, the sailors saw a sight both absurd and astonishing. A lone cat adrift amid carnage. They hauled him aboard, wiping oil from his fur, wrapping him in cloth, laughing in disbelief. To bring a cat out of such a slaughter seemed like a miracle, and miracles were rare on the Atlantic. The British named him Oscar, after the naval signal flag for man overboard. It was a joke at first, but one made with affection. Oscar blinked at his new world of foreign voices and strange uniforms. Perhaps he felt the same rhythms, the thrum of engines, the roll of the deck, the eternal sound of water striking hull. A ship was a ship, and men were men. He licked a paw, smoothed back his ears, and resumed the eternal feline duty of carrying on as if nothing unusual had occurred. But already his story was gathering weight. Sailors murmured about his survival. A cat, the only creature to live through the end of the Bismarck? Some took it as a blessing, others eyed him warily. The sea has long been a place of omens, and an animal that survives where thousands perish becomes more than just an animal. It becomes a sign. The Cossack would take him into her company, and fate would test him again. But on that first day, as he curled into the crook of a sailor's arm and purred against the hum of engines, none could have foreseen the strange odyssey ahead. The sea had claimed its titans, but the cat remained. What lay ahead for Oscar would defy belief. The sailors of HMS Cossack were no strangers to danger. They had escorted convoys through the U-boat-infested Atlantic, had fired their guns in anger, and had seen men vanish into the waves in the blink of an eye. Yet when they plucked a sodden black and white cat from a floating plank after the Bismarck went under, it was as if the sea itself had granted them a strange reprieve. Oscar, as they called him, quickly became part of the destroyer's company. He padded along the narrow passageways, his whiskers twitching at every sound, his tail flicking with the nonchalance of a creature utterly at home in his own skin. War was raging around him, but to Oscar, the world was simple. Warm corners, scraps of food from friendly hands, and the steady throb of the engines beneath his paws. Superstition ran as thick as salt water in the veins of sailors. For centuries they had carried cats to sea not only to hunt vermin, but to ward off misfortune. The men of the Cossack took Oscar's survival from the Bismarck as proof of these beliefs. He was not simply a cat, he was an omen of endurance. To them, he had stared into the abyss and returned with his whiskers dry. Even the more skeptical sailors, men hardened by too many winters at sea, found comfort in the sight of him stretched out lazily on a coil of ropes. If a cat could remain so calm amid such chaos, then perhaps fate had not turned entirely against them. But superstition has two edges. To some, Oscar was blessed. To others, he was touched by something darker. A cat that survives a sinking is either luck itself or cursed enough to bring down another. Still, the crew kept him close. They fed him, let him curl at their feet, and scratched him behind the ears when the nights grew long. In war, small comforts matter. Oscar gave them a sense of home. Oscar was more than a mascot. He hunted. He stalked the holds and storerooms where rats scurried, his eyes glinting in the dim light. A good ship's cat was worth his weight in gold. A single rat could chew through grain sacks, gnaw rope, or spread disease. Oscar patrolled tirelessly, and the men swore he was as efficient as any weapon they carried. At night, when the sea grew black and the stars wheeled overhead, Oscar often padded out onto the deck. Sailors on watch would glance down and see him sitting perfectly still, staring into the endless horizon, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. It unnerved some, comforted others. To the crew of Cossack, the black and white Tom was becoming more than a pet. He was a companion, a creature whose instincts belonged to the sea as much as their own. Then, in October of 1941, the sea tested him again. The Cossack was escorting a convoy from Gibraltar when the German submarine U-563 slipped into position under the cover of darkness. The torpedo struck with a thunderclap, ripping open the bow of the destroyer. Men were thrown from hammocks, alarms wailed, and the ship shuddered as if wounded. Water poured in, flooding compartments. More than 150 men were killed in an instant. In the chaos, sailors scrambled to stations, shouting over the roar of water and the groan of twisted steel. And there, darting through the smoke and shadows, was Oscar. Some swore they saw him crouched in a corridor, yowling, but unhurt. his eyes wide and glowing like lamps. Others later claimed they had carried him in their arms during the frantic evacuation. What mattered was this: when the survivors were pulled from the dying ship, Oscar was among them. The men of HMS Legion, which had come to aid the crippled destroyer, were astonished to see the cat once again. "Not you again," one sailor is said to have joked, as if Oscar had become some impossible talisman that simply refused to die. The Cossack, mortally wounded, stayed afloat for 2 days before sinking beneath rough seas. Oscar had escaped. Again. By now, word was spreading. First the Bismarck, now the Cossack, and always the same cat, dry and alive at the end. He had cheated death twice in 6 months. The Royal Navy sailors, in their rough humor, began calling him Unsinkable Sam. The name stuck. Some sailors swore by him, touching his fur before going on duty as though he were a lucky charm. Others shook their heads, muttering that a cat with so many lives was bound to bring trouble. But whatever their belief, none could deny that he had survived the unthinkable. And in the strange liminal world of war at sea, where death was as close as the next torpedo, that survival meant something. It was a story to cling to, a story to laugh about in the mess hall, a story that whispered maybe, just maybe, we'll make it out of this. But the sea was not finished with Sam. The Royal Navy had a way of repurposing everything in wartime. Ships captured or patched, tools scavenged, men reassigned. And so it was with the black and white Tom, who had now survived 2 sinkings. He was moved, as sailors were moved, from one ship to the next, this time to the great aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. To the men who welcomed him aboard, Sam was already a legend. News traveled fast in wartime, passed from mouth to mouth in bars and dockyards, and sailors love a good story. "That cat's already beaten the Bismarck and the Cossack," someone whispered as Sam trotted down the gangway, his tail high, his paws silent on the steel deck. "If he's still here, maybe we'll be safe too." The Ark Royal was unlike the smaller destroyers Sam had known. She was vast, a floating city of steel with more than 1,500 men aboard. Her flight deck stretched out like an endless field, her hangars full of swordfish torpedo bombers and Fulmar fighters. Planes roared into the sky daily, their engines vibrating through the whole ship. For a cat, it must have been both bewildering and exhilarating. So many corners, so many smells, so many places to hide and hunt. Sam found his spots quickly. He prowled the mess decks in search of scraps, curled himself on warm pipes, and eyed the pigeons and gulls that circled the carrier when she was close to port. The sailors doted on him. They scratched his chin, carried him on their shoulders, and laughed when he claimed a captain's chair for his nap. He was no longer just a mouser. He was a mascot, a companion, a creature who had stared down the abyss and returned. The men of Ark Royal liked to joke that if Sam had 9 lives, he'd already spent 2. The trouble was, the sea was greedy. On November 14, 1941, Ark Royal was returning from Malta, where she had delivered desperately needed aircraft. The Mediterranean lay blue and deceptively calm, but beneath its surface, German U-boats prowled like wolves. One of them, U-81, found its prey. At 15:41 hours, a single torpedo slammed into Ark Royal's starboard side. The explosion ripped through bulkheads, sent men tumbling, and knocked the great ship onto a list. Alarms shrieked. Water poured in with a roar. Planes clattered and smashed as the deck tilted. Men scrambled to damage control stations. Some rushed to stem the flooding, others to jettison weight. Orders barked, sirens wailed, steel groaned. Amid this chaos, Sam once again appeared, shaken but alive. One sailor later claimed he saw the cat leap from a passageway into a lifeboat, his fur bristling, his eyes wide. Another swore he watched him claw his way onto a floating plank as the ship's tilt grew worse. For hours, Ark Royal fought to stay alive. She did not go down quickly like the Bismarck, or suddenly like the Cossack. She lingered, groaning, as though refusing to admit defeat. Through the night, rescue ships crowded close. By morning, her fate was sealed. The great carrier rolled slowly, deliberately, and slid beneath the waves. Only one man was lost out of her vast crew, and among the survivors, found wet, furious, and glaring at the sea, was Sam. Pulled aboard by a laughing sailor, he shook off water, hissed at the spray, and then, as if nothing unusual had occurred, began grooming himself. Angry but quite unharmed, one witness described him. Three ships, three sinkings, and the same cat. By now, no one could dismiss it as a coincidence. Sailors whispered of the cat the sea could not claim. They called him Unsinkable Sam, and the name spread from decks to dockyards, newspapers to ports. For men who had survived torpedoes and sinking steel, Sam became more than a mascot. He was proof that survival was possible. In their dark humor, they joked he should be retired before he sank the entire Royal Navy. Behind the laughter, though, he was something deeper, hope in a world that often offered none. By the time he was hauled, wet and furious, from the wreck of Ark Royal, Sam's story had grown larger than the cat himself. Newspapers embraced him. Britain, weary of losses, loved him. A black and white Tom surviving 3 disasters was irresistible. His portrait, later painted by Georgina Shaw Baker, shows him perched on driftwood, his whiskers blowing in the sea breeze. And yet the story frays under scrutiny. Bismarck survivors remembered no ship's cat. Photos showed more than one Sam. Perhaps he joined the Navy in Gibraltar, and the rest was sailors' embroidery. Still, what mattered was not the details, but the meaning. In 1941, amid blitz and U-boats, Sam's survival was a tonic. Even if myth, he was real enough, real as hope, real as the belief that even amid fire and water, a fragile life could endure. By late 1941, the Admiralty had made its decision. Unsinkable Sam had used up more than enough of his 9 lives. A cat who had outlasted the Bismarck, the Cossack, and the Ark Royal did not belong on another deck. He had proven his point. The sea had tested him 3 times, and 3 times he had refused to yield. To send him back out was tempting fate, or so the sailors joked. So the Navy retired him, not with medals or ceremony, but with something rarer in wartime: peace. Sam's first stop was Gibraltar, that fortress of rock at the edge of the Mediterranean. Here, amid barracks and offices carved into stone, he settled into a quieter rhythm. Instead of the thrum of engines and the roll of steel decks, he now padded across sun-baked courtyards and narrow corridors, stalking lizards and mice with the same cold efficiency he had once used on rats in the holds of warships. The governor's staff took to him quickly. To have the unsinkable cat prowling their offices was a point of pride and a story to tell any visitor. Naval officers stopping over on their way east or west would nod when they saw him, as if acknowledging a fellow veteran. There was something almost ceremonial in the way men saluted his survival, not with actual gestures, but with a quiet respect reserved for someone who had seen the worst and endured. And yet, even in this sanctuary, Sam carried the weight of his reputation. Dockside gossip still followed him. Sailors who spotted him sunning himself on a Gibraltar wall whispered, "That's him, the cat from the Bismarck." For a while, he was more famous than some admirals. Eventually, Sam was moved north, across the sea to Britain, then further still to Northern Ireland, where he was given to a seaman's home in Belfast. Here, among retired sailors, he lived out the remainder of the war and beyond. Life in Belfast was slower, more domestic. Sam curled by the hearth fires instead of boilers. He listened to the chatter of old men instead of alarms. He padded through halls filled with pipe smoke and the smell of stewed tea, stopping to be scratched by hands roughened from decades at sea. To those retired sailors, Sam was more than a mouser. He was a living link to their world, a reminder of the sea's caprice. He grew plump, he grew content. The sharp edge of war dulled into a rhythm of naps and meals. Visitors remarked that the once lean ship's cat had softened into a gentleman of leisure, his coat glossy, his eyes still bright. And yet, when he stretched on the windowsill or batted at a dangling cord, there remained in his posture the poise of a survivor, as if somewhere deep inside he still remembered the cold bite of seawater and the groan of sinking steel. Unsinkable Sam lived until 1955. He was by then an old Tom, slow in his steps, grayer around the muzzle, his days reduced to warmth and rest. He passed quietly, not at sea but on land, in the safety he had earned. There was no fanfare, no obituary in the major papers. The war had ended a decade earlier, and the world was already deep into new crises. But those who knew his story, those who had carried him from one ship to another, remembered. A cat who had stared down the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, who had cheated torpedoes and the abyss, had finally laid down his weary head for the last time. Sam's legend, however, did not die with him. In the years after, his story was retold in books and naval histories, sometimes faithfully, sometimes embellished. The confusion between cats, Tabby, Tuxedo, Simon of the Amethyst, only added to the myth, as though the sea itself wanted to blur fact and fable. But one artifact remains clear, the pastel portrait painted by Georgina Shawbaker. In it, Sam is depicted as he was remembered, perched on driftwood, gazing toward the horizon, proud and unbowed. His black and white fur is rendered in soft strokes, his eyes bright and watchful. Around him is the vast, empty sea. That portrait hangs in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London, serving as evidence that his legend has become part of naval heritage. Visitors who come upon it often pause, drawn in not just by the art, but by the story. The caption tells the story of a cat that survived the sinking of 3 ships during World War II. It does not matter if every detail is true. What matters is that the idea endures, that in the heart of a war that swallowed so many lives, one small creature refused to be claimed. Sam's tale lives on because it speaks to something deep in us: survival, defiance, the ability to emerge from disaster not unscathed but alive. Sailors cling to such stories because the sea offers no guarantees. History clings to them because they remind us that even in wars measured in millions of deaths, a single life, even a cat's, can symbolize hope. Unsinkable Sam never commanded men, never fired a gun, never charted a course, but he endured, and that endurance became legend. He was a ship's cat, nothing more, nothing less. Yet he became more memorable than many admirals, remembered not for strategy or victory, but for surviving outdoor disasters. If you've made it this far, please consider clicking those subscribe and like buttons. Want more outdoor disasters content? Check out these videos I believe you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching.